They silenced him. Or at least, they tried. On a quiet morning in Ouagadougou, as the sun crept over the rooftops, a message landed on the desk of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, one that would spark a fire across the continent. The United Nations had cancelled his speech. No warning. No explanation that made sense. Just a cold, calculated move to erase his voice. But they underestimated him. Because when you block one microphone in Africa, 1,000 others rise up. What they thought was a dismissal turned into the beginning of something far bigger. Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not done. He was just getting started. If you believe that a small nation can still stand tall against global powers, if you believe that Africa deserves to write its own story, in its own voice, if you've ever seen the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes, then this story belongs to you too. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel, not just to support us, but to walk this road with us. Together, we are part of a rising wave. What began as whispers, has become a silent storm. But the blow didn't end with silence, it was just beginning. Behind the closed doors of New York, Paris, and London, a plan had been set in motion. Intelligence briefings landed on Captain Ibrahim Traoré's desk within hours. Encrypted cables, intercepted calls, and classified memos all pointed to one chilling truth: this wasn't a clerical error. It was an orchestrated strike. 3 permanent members of the UN Security Council had lobbied hard to erase him from the schedule. The motive? Fear, not of Burkina Faso's size, but of its defiance. Traoré's planned speech would have unveiled something dangerous to the status quo, a vision for an African economic alliance independent of Western control. He was set to challenge the very system that had for decades dictated the terms of Africa's development. In a leaked meeting transcript, one Western diplomat allegedly described him as another Sankara. And we all know how that ended. The threat wasn't subtle. The implication was terrifying. To Captain Ibrahim Traoré, it was confirmation. His country's demand that 55% of mining profits remain in Burkina Faso had already angered powerful multinationals. But this was a new front. Not just economic pressure, but diplomatic erasure. For a brief moment, the palace fell into stillness. The weight of what had happened, and what it meant, pressed on everyone in the room. But Traoré did not panic. He didn't rant. He simply stood, eyes locked on the map of Africa on the wall. They fear one speech, he said calmly, then let's give them 54. The streets of Ouagadougou didn't need an official statement. Word spread faster than any broadcast. Within hours of the news breaking, murmurs turned into defiant chants. From the open-air markets to the dusty courtyards, people knew something was wrong. This wasn't just a scheduling issue, it was an insult. A slap in the face of a country finally beginning to stand on its own terms. University students were the first to react. They gathered at the main square, waving handwritten signs, some bearing quotes from Thomas Sankara, others calling out the United Nations directly. Taxi drivers turned off their meters and circled the presidential compound, honking in protest. Local radio stations abandoned regular programming to play old revolutionary songs on repeat. Across the capital, a silent fire was growing, steady, stubborn, and deeply personal. Inside the palace, the mood was different. No shouting. No chaos. Just silence and purpose. Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked the length of the war room slowly, listening, not reacting. His advisors reported threats from multinational mining firms, increased surveillance on government servers, and disturbing movements at Western military bases near Burkina Faso's borders. And yet, Traoré remained still. He didn't call for cameras. He didn't post statements online. Instead, he asked one question: how far are they willing to go to silence us? What no one outside the palace saw was the preparation happening behind closed doors. Encrypted communications were initiated. Strategic partners were alerted. The intelligence team worked non-stop, piecing together the real picture behind the diplomatic ambush. Outside, the people shouted. Inside, their leader stayed quiet, not because he was afraid, but because he was calculating. They had tried to isolate Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Instead, they had awakened something far more powerful, a nation, and soon, a continent, ready to answer back. The silence didn't last long. That same evening, deep inside the presidential compound, Captain Ibrahim Traoré summoned his inner circle to the situation room. The lights were dim, the air heavy. Everyone knew this wasn't a routine briefing. There were no journalists, no fanfare. Only a map of Africa stretched across the wall and the eyes of a man who had seen through the facade of diplomacy. He stood by the table, fingers tracing the borders of neighboring nations, then spoke calmly. "It's time for Plan Continental." No one questioned him. The plan had been conceived months earlier, a quiet contingency for the moment Burkina Faso would face external sabotage. It was bold, risky, and if executed well, historic. Its essence was simple: unity. If they tried to silence one African leader, then dozens would rise. But it required speed, precision, and total secrecy. Encrypted communications were launched within the hour. First to Mali, Niger, and Guinea, trusted allies who had also begun distancing themselves from foreign control. Then to Kenya, South Africa, Algeria. One by one, replies came in. Yes. We stand with you. Yes. Let them hear us. Yes. It's time. By midnight, 23 countries had joined the call. By sunrise, it was 38. The numbers weren't just symbolic, they were a warning. A silent line had been crossed, and Africa, often divided by borders drawn in colonial backrooms, was now answering as one. In the intelligence hub, data streams poured in. Satellite feeds showed unusual Western military activity near key African borders. Analysts flagged movements at French and American bases in Niger and Côte d'Ivoire. Meanwhile, intercepted messages confirmed what Traoré had suspected. Pressure was now being applied to other African leaders to distance themselves from Burkina Faso. But something had changed. This time, they didn't bend. In Ethiopia, the foreign minister rejected a last-minute call from Washington. In Ghana, a national news outlet ran a headline that read, "You silenced Traoré. But you woke Africa." In Senegal, artists began painting murals of Captain Ibrahim Traoré surrounded by flames, not of destruction, but of rebirth. Back in Ouagadougou, the final preparations for the summit began. Not a reaction, but a redefinition. This wasn't just retaliation. It was construction. Construction of a new voice, a new framework, a new era. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't need the UN stage anymore. He was building one of his own, and across Africa, the audience was already waiting. The world still believed it was in control. But the ground had already shifted. While media headlines in New York and Paris dismissed the UN snub as a minor scheduling issue, something entirely different was unfolding in Ouagadougou. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had not only survived the attempted silencing, he had transformed it into a stage none of them saw coming. A summit. Not in Geneva. Not in Brussels. But in the heart of West Africa. And it wouldn't follow the old rules. Preparations began at dawn. The national stadium of Burkina Faso, usually reserved for football matches, was converted into a makeshift diplomatic arena. Engineers worked through the night. Translators were recruited from universities. Volunteers cleaned, painted, organized transport. Farmers donated food. Merchants donated time. And no one asked for payment. Across the city, banners were raised. Not of political parties or corporate sponsors, but of Africa itself. A continent reimagining its identity. Word spread quickly, reaching cities from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. Delegations began confirming attendance. Not just from Africa, but from the global South, Latin America, Southeast Asia, even small island nations. What began as a local response was becoming an international movement. And the symbolism? It was intentional. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had ordered that there be no podium. No hierarchy. No nation placed above another. Instead, a perfect circle of chairs. Equal distance. Equal weight. It shocked even the most seasoned diplomats. In a world obsessed with status and seating arrangements, Traoré had sent a powerful message: Africa would no longer stand at the back. On the morning of the summit, the stadium filled, not with spectacle, but with something rarer, dignity. Cultural storytellers from across the continent opened the ceremony. They didn't speak of politics. They spoke of memory, of how Africa once stood strong before it was divided, stripped, and spoken for. Their voices echoed through the stands like drums calling soldiers to formation. Then, as the last storyteller bowed, the silence returned. All eyes turned to the circle. Captain Ibrahim Traoré rose. Slowly. Deliberately. He wasn't just a man giving a speech. He was the proof that Africa's voice, long dismissed, long delayed, had never truly been lost. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to return. And that moment had come. And then, the moment they had tried so desperately to prevent, arrived. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the center of the circle. No grand podium. No bulletproof glass. Just a microphone, a folder of handwritten notes, and the weight of a continent's expectations resting on his shoulders. For a few seconds, the world held its breath. Then he spoke, calmly, firmly. Distinguished leaders, brothers and sisters of Africa and the global South, we gather here today not because of a cancelled speech, but because of the future it dared to imagine. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. With unwavering clarity, Captain Ibrahim Traoré exposed the diplomatic sabotage that had taken place. He presented leaked cables, whistleblower recordings, and intelligence findings confirming that powerful nations had not only lobbied to silence him, but had threatened to withdraw UN funding unless his address was removed. Gasps filled the stadium. Delegates whispered. Journalists scrambled to record. But Traoré wasn't finished. He shifted from revelation to revolution. Page by page, he laid out the plan they had feared, an African monetary fund. Independent of the IMF and World Bank. A sovereign resource alliance, where no nation would sign mining contracts alone. A unified diplomatic bloc, with one voice demanding permanent African representation on the UN Security Council. For too long, he said, we have negotiated separately, from positions of weakness. But when we speak together, we are no longer small. We are no longer silent. The crowd rose. A full standing ovation. The circle became a wave of unity, of leaders nodding, clapping, some with tears in their eyes. It wasn't just applause, it was affirmation. Over the next 72 hours, history was written at a speed few had ever seen. 43 nations signed the founding charter of the African Monetary Fund. 38 committed to a joint resource negotiation framework. And a declaration was made, one that shocked the world. Africa would move forward on its own terms. Meanwhile, Western diplomats watched helplessly. Their carefully constructed order had been shaken not by violence or war, but by dignity, truth, and organization. As the summit ended, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood once more, this time at the airport, shaking hands with departing leaders. The president of Ethiopia embraced him and said, "They tried to silence you in New York." Traoré smiled softly. "They didn't silence me," he replied. "They amplified us all." By the time the summit concluded, the world had changed, and many hadn't even realized it yet. In the days that followed, headlines shifted. The story was no longer about a cancelled speech. It was about a continent that had refused to be sidelined. Analysts scrambled to make sense of the sudden wave of alignment among African nations. Western media outlets, once dismissive, now framed the Ouagadougou summit as a surprise diplomatic realignment. But for those who had been watching closely, and for those who had lived it, it was never sudden. It was inevitable. Captain Ibrahim Traoré returned to his modest presidential office, the same place where, just weeks earlier, he had first heard that he would be banned from speaking at the UN. Now, on that same desk, sat the signed founding documents of the African Monetary Fund and the Joint Charter for Resource Sovereignty. The symmetry of it all was poetic. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. True change, he knew, wasn't sealed with applause. It would be tested in the months and years to come, through sabotage attempts, foreign pressure, and internal resistance. But one truth remained: Africa had found its voice, and no one could unhear it. On social media, the term Ouaga spirit began trending. Young Africans across the continent shared clips of Traoré's speech, painted murals, and posted handwritten letters addressed to the Captain of Courage. In Nigeria, students organized a summit watch party. In Senegal, musicians remixed his speech into a protest anthem. In Kenya, schoolchildren recited parts of it in classrooms. It was no longer just politics. It was culture. It was memory in motion. But perhaps the most striking image came not from a speech or a headline, but from a moment of silence. One evening, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood alone on the balcony of the presidential residence, watching the sun set over Ouagadougou. The flags of 47 nations still fluttered along the city's avenues. He sipped a cup of green tea brought by Musa, his old friend, his trusted companion. "They'll push back," Musa said quietly. "They already are," Traoré replied. "But this time, we're not standing alone." He turned back toward his office, toward the folders, the maps, the unfinished plans. Because for Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the summit was not the destination. It was only the beginning. If you believe that a small nation can still challenge global empires, if you believe that Africa deserves to lead with its own voice, if you believe that silence can be broken by truth, then this story was never just his, that it was yours too. And it's only just begun. If you believe that a small nation can still stand tall against the weight of global empires, if you believe that Africa has the right to write its own story, in its own voice, on its own terms, if you've ever seen the fire burning in the eyes of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, then this story belongs to you too. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel, not just to support, but to stand beside us. This is not a moment. It's a movement that a quiet storm is rising across this continent, and it will not be stopped. The whispers have become thunder, and together, we are the sound of a continent waking up. The comments poured in from every corner of the continent, and far beyond. People were not just reacting to a video. They were responding to a moment they had long been waiting for. Many viewers spoke of pride. Not the manufactured kind, but something deep and ancestral. They said they had goosebumps watching Captain Ibrahim Traoré rise in silence, only to speak with the voice of millions. Some compared him to Thomas Sankara, saying the torch had finally been passed. Others called him the captain of the new Africa. One viewer from Nigeria wrote that they had never seen a leader so calm under pressure, and yet so powerful in message. A woman from South Africa commented that she cried when the summit circle appeared on screen, because for the first time, she felt Africa was speaking as one. There were many who admitted they didn't even know the speech had been banned, but after hearing what was silenced, they understood why. People spoke of betrayal by the global system, but more importantly, of hope ignited by African unity. Several comments came from young Africans saying this was the first political video that made them feel inspired instead of helpless. Some said they showed the speech to their children. One viewer in Kenya said it reminded them that Africa is not poor, just disorganized. But now, maybe that was changing. Diaspora voices also joined in, from France, Canada, Brazil, expressing that for once, African leadership didn't feel like a puppet show. There was anger, yes, but it was overshadowed by determination. The phrase, Waga spirit, echoed across the comments section, with users creating their own slogans, hashtags, and declarations. Some simply wrote, "We are awake now. And we're not going back." Others said nothing at all, just dropped the Burkina Faso emoji and a clenched fist. And somehow, that said everything. The story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré teaches us that silence is not always defeat, sometimes, it is preparation. When powerful institutions attempted to erase his voice from the global stage, they underestimated the power of quiet resistance and underestimated Africa's growing awareness. One of the most important lessons from this moment is that sovereignty cannot be granted by others, it must be claimed. Traoré's calm reaction to being banned from the UN was not weakness, but a strategic pause before a greater move. It revealed that leadership is not about reacting loudly, but responding wisely. His actions remind us that true authority comes not from international approval, but from the people who stand behind you. We also learned that unity is not just a dream, it is possible. The speed with which African nations responded to the call for a new summit, and the scale of their collaboration, proved that the continent is more connected than it appears on paper. When leaders choose principle over pressure, the people respond with power. The summit in Ouagadougou was more than a symbolic event. It showed that Africa can set its own agenda, define its own diplomacy, and rewrite the rules imposed upon it. Another lesson lies in the importance of narrative. The West tried to silence a speech, but Traoré turned that silence into a movement. By controlling the narrative, by gathering allies, and by using technology and cultural memory, he turned marginalization into momentum. Finally, the story teaches us that courage does not always shout. Sometimes, it simply refuses to back down. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood firm not for personal glory, but for the future of a continent. In doing so, he reminded millions that Africa's voice has never disappeared. It was simply waiting for someone to speak, and for others to listen. Another powerful lesson from this story is that real diplomacy doesn't always require permission from global powers. Sometimes, it begins at home, in modest offices, humble rooms, and among citizens who simply refuse to be ignored. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't wait for international validation. He created his own platform, and through it, demonstrated that legitimacy can come from conviction, not approval. This is especially important for smaller nations often excluded from decision-making at global forums. The summit in Ouagadougou proved that even countries without massive economies or military power can lead by example, with vision, clarity, and courage. We also learn that leadership today demands more than authority, it demands symbolism. Every gesture Traoré made, from the circular seating of leaders to choosing traditional storytellers to open the summit, sent a message that African values were not outdated relics, but living tools for a different future. He didn't just change the meeting. He changed the meaning of meetings. Finally, the story reminds us that transformation is not instant. What happened in Ouagadougou was a spark, but for that fire to burn, it must be protected, nurtured, and passed on. The youth who listen to Traore's words must now become the leaders who act on them. The unity shown at the summit must survive the pressures that will surely come. But now, there is a blueprint. A real, living example that when Africa speaks with one voice, even the world listens.